What would you do if a child vanished without a trace, leaving only a glittery backpack and a juice box behind? In a quiet Oregon town, one dog refused to give up when everyone else did. This is the gripping true story of Officer Dan Ruiz and his loyal partner, Echo, a German shepherd with an uncanny ability to sense what no one else could. If you believe in second chances and the unbreakable bond between a dog and their human, hit that subscribe button for K9 Miracle Stories, because this tale of courage, instinct, and hope will leave you speechless. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was a backpack. A pink, glittery backpack, half-zipped, abandoned by the swings at Magnolia Park. Inside, a juice box, still sealed, and a crumpled drawing of a rainbow. No footprints. No screams. Just a soft wind rustling through the trees, a fading sunset, and the eerie absence of Lily Walker, 9 years old, brown hair in a braid, rainbow sneakers, smart, shy, and always home by 4:15. Except today. At 4:32 p.m., Lily's mother, Sarah, called to school, her voice trembling. She didn't come home. She's always home by now. By 4:39, Sarah was driving through the neighborhood, scanning playgrounds, calling Lily's name out the car window. By 5:10, the sheriff department had sealed off Magnolia Park with yellow tape. A rescue grid formed as volunteers poured in, neighbors, teachers, even teenagers wielding flashlights. They combed the woods, peeked into old sheds, and shouted Lily's name into the bushes. But as night fell and a cold chill settled over the sleepy Oregon town, the voices grew quieter. The flashlights dimmed. Hope began to fade. Officer Daniel Ruiz was on hour 14 of his shift when the call came through. Another missing kid. Another frantic parent. Another ticking clock. He glanced at his partner, Echo, a black and tan German shepherd, sitting like a statue beside the cruiser. Tongue curled, ears perked. Echo wasn't the fastest or flashiest canine on the force. He was older, his muzzle flecked with gray, but he had something deeper, an instinct Dan couldn't explain. Echo always knew which door to pause at, which closet to stare into, which bush held more than leaves. When others gave up, Echo lingered. Sometimes, that was all it took. They arrived at Magnolia Park at 6:42 p.m. The scene was calm but tense. Media vans lined the edge of the park, their lights casting harsh shadows. Flashlights dotted the fields like fireflies. A drone buzzed overhead, its hum cutting through the murmurs of volunteers. A coordinator handed Dan a laminated map of the search radius. She vanished right after school, the man said, his voice clipped. Witnesses saw her on the swings, alone. Then nothing. Backpack was found here. He pointed to the base of a slide, where the pink bag lay like a wound in the grass. Dan nodded and clipped Echo's leash. Let's get to work. He gave a command, and Echo lowered his nose, weaving through the grass, around benches, toward the trees. For 15 minutes, Echo circled, sniffed, doubled back. He paused at chain link fence and sat, his eyes fixed on the metal links. Dan took note. Something. Echo moved again, this time toward the creek bed running beneath the park. A concrete storm drain, its mouth covered in moss and rust, yawned open ahead. Echo stopped, stared, tail low, ears stiff. Then he whimpered. Most dogs bark. Echo mourned. Dan stepped forward and peered into the pipe. Darkness swallowed the beam of his flashlight. He scanned inside, moisture on concrete, scattered leaves, no sound, no movement. A search supervisor approached, frowning. Already checked it. Small drainage tunnel. Just runoff. Doesn't go far. Echo thinks otherwise, Dan said, his voice steady. He's just picking up old scent. Maybe. Dan let Echo stay by the pipe while he searched elsewhere. But every time he called Echo away, the dog returned. Same spot, same silence, same eyes locked on the void. By midnight, most teams had packed up. Rain began to fall, light at first, then steady. Lily was still missing. The next morning's headlines screamed what no one wanted to admit. Search for Lily Walker comes up empty. At the sheriff's office, Dan stared at a corkboard map pinned with search zones. Echo lay on the floor beside him, paws tucked, eyes alert. Every few minutes, the dog glanced at the door. You still think she's there? Dan asked quietly. Echo didn't move. Dan grabbed his coat. They returned to the park alone. No news crews. No volunteers. Just early sunlight filtering through damp leaves. Echo leapt from the cruiser before the engine cut, heading straight for the storm drain. Dan followed. There was something about Echo's posture, rigid, unblinking, not alert but pleading, as if the dog wasn't pointing at something but begging Dan to believe him. Dan knelt. All right, buddy, one more time. He leaned into the pipe, shined his flashlight. Still nothing. Then he thought he saw movement. He blinked. Nothing. He turned the light off, waited. Seconds ticked by. Then a sound, faint like fabric scraping concrete. A hand, small, trembling, pale, slid out from behind a bend in the pipe. Fingers reaching, barely moving. Dan's heart froze. Lily, he whispered. Underscore, 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 underscore. If stories of courage and unbreakable loyalty move you, don't miss a single tale of heroism. Subscribe to K9 Miracle Stories on YouTube, where we share real accounts of brave canines and the lives they save. Every like and share helps these stories reach those who believe in second chances and four-legged heroes. Dan radioed it in. Paramedics, fire rescue, backup. He crawled partway into the tunnel, speaking gently, guiding Lily with his voice. You're okay now. I'm here. Echo's here. When they pulled her out, she was soaked, shivering, barely conscious. Dehydrated, cold but alive, wrapped in a foil blanket. She whispered, just loud enough for Dan to hear. I heard the dog. What? The dog. He was there. I stayed awake because I heard him. Echo sat beside the stretcher, licking her wrist gently as the medics worked. His tail moved once, a slow, deliberate wag. They later learned Lily had been followed after school by a man in a hoodie. No one saw it. She'd panicked, squeezing through brush and crawling into the storm drain to hide. She'd gotten lost in the dark, fallen asleep. When the rain came, she stayed put, too afraid to move, terrified she'd never find her way out. She said she felt like no one was coming, until she heard Echo outside the pipe. She knew someone hadn't given up. The press didn't cover that part. The footage showed the rescue, the ambulance, the crying parents, but not the dog who stood vigil at a hole in the ground when everyone else had left. Not the whimper that woke a girl from fading sleep. But Lily would never forget. Neither would Dan. Neither would Echo. The local paper called it a miracle. Lost girl found in storm drain thanks to Canine Hero. Pictures ran front and center. Lily wrapped in a silver blanket, her face pale but eyes open, Echo beside her like a statue, the perfect portrait of calm and loyalty. But by the next morning, the miracle was being dissected. News vans rolled out. Reporters moved on to the next fire, the next scandal. While Lily recovered in the hospital, while her parents cried in the hallway and thanked every god they could think of, questions began to circle. Whispers. Doubts. She must have wandered in there herself. Why didn't she yell sooner? Maybe it wasn't an abduction at all. Are we sure she didn't make it up? Officer Dan Ruiz heard it first at the precinct. Someone dropped a manila envelope on his desk labeled Lily Walker. Internal note. Inside were typed reports, a timeline analysis, and commentary from a behavioral analyst out of Salem. The phrase possible fabrication or trauma-induced confusion was underlined in red ink. Dan stared at the page for a long time. Then he looked at Echo, curled beside his boots, tail lightly flicking. She didn't make it up, he said softly. Echo opened one eye, giving him that familiar look. We're not done yet. A few days later, Dan visited Lily in the hospital. She was awake but quiet, her parents polite but exhausted. The air in the room felt heavy, like everyone was bracing for something. Blame, more questions, or just a weight of what had happened. Lily didn't speak much, but when she saw Echo, her eyes lit up. She motioned for him to come closer. Echo trotted to her bedside and rested his head on the mattress. He came back, she whispered. Dan knelt beside her. You remember what happened? She nodded slowly. I ran. A man. He was wearing dark clothes. I think he was following me. Did you see his face? She shook her head. No, just boots. And his voice. He told me to stop. Dan felt his chest tighten. And that's when you hid in the pipe? I wanted to wait until he left, but then I got lost. It got dark and I fell asleep. But I heard Echo outside. He was the only one. She paused, her voice barely audible. I knew I wasn't invisible anymore. Dan typed a full report and turned it in. It was filed. No further questions were asked. The sheriff's office claimed there was no surveillance footage, no physical evidence of an abduction. They chalked it up to a child running from fear, a misinterpretation. Case closed. Dan knew better. So did Echo. He returned to the scene alone. The storm drain was now covered with temporary fencing, but the area beyond the park felt wrong. Not the crime scene itself, but something nearby, a stillness that didn't sit right. Echo was on edge again, not barking, just watching. Dan let him lead. They walked past the park's edge, through overgrown brush, into a wooded area behind a storage facility and a seldom used maintenance road. About 100 yards and Echo froze, then lowered his head, sniffing in circles. Dan followed. What is it, buddy? Echo stopped at a tree trunk where the grass was flattened. Next to it, something small, a crushed juice box, the same brand as the one in Lily's backpack. Dan's stomach turned. You're saying she made it this far? Echo wagged once. They searched for another hour, found more signs. A partial footprint, large. A torn piece of fabric caught on barbed wire. Dan photographed everything. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough for a case. That night, he brought the evidence to Mia Reynolds, a local crime analyst who'd left Portland PD after burnout. She reviewed the photos, her eyes narrowing. Looks like she was chased. She didn't just run and hide. She was being hunted. Dan nodded, but no one believes it. They don't want to believe it, Mia said, sipping her coffee. You open that door, and suddenly you've got a predator in a suburban park. You think the mayor wants that headline. Dan looked away. So we do nothing? Mia slid the juice box across the table. We keep looking. Off the books. Echo and Dan went back every night that week. Each time, Echo led them to something new. A scent trail near a utility shed, a rusted flashlight under a pile of branches, a section of fence bent open and tied back with zip ties. Too many coincidences. Not enough proof. Dan documented it all, quietly building a file at home. If the department wouldn't take it seriously, he'd make sure someone did. On Friday night, Echo did something he hadn't done since finding Lily. He sat in front of a pile of rocks and whimpered. Dan moved the rocks aside. Beneath them, in a shallow dugout, was a torn black hoodie, too small for an adult, too large for a child. Inside the pocket, a burner phone, battery dead. Dan held it up in the flashlight beam. Got you. At home, he charged the phone with a universal cable. It powered on. No contacts, no text history. But in the gallery, one photo, a blurry image of the Magnolia Park sign. Time-stamped 2 hours before Lily went missing. Someone had scoped the place. Dan's fingers clenched around the phone. He called Mia. You were right. By the next morning, the photo had been traced to a disposable email backup tied to 3 other burner devices used in reported loitering incidents across the state. Outside schools, daycares, a public pool. Whoever this was, he'd been traveling, watching, and now he was gone. Dan walked into the station Monday morning and dropped the phone on the captain's desk. You need to reopen the case. The captain frowned. Where did you get this? Off the books. Echo tracked it. You understand this isn't proper chain of custody. Chain of custody didn't find Lily. Dan snapped. The room went quiet. He straightened. I'm not trying to be a hero, but we have a pattern. We have a person out there who isn't done. The captain leaned back. I'll elevate it quietly, but don't go rogue again. Dan nodded once, then walked out, Echo at his side. That evening, he visited Lily again. She was drawing with crayons, simple shapes, stick figures. One was a dog. When she saw him, she smiled. I told Mom I want to be like Echo when I grow up. Dan grinned. You mean strong and quiet? She nodded. And brave. Echo nudged her hand with his nose. She giggled. Back home, Dan updated his corkboard. It wasn't just anymore. It was six. 6 towns, 6 parks. 6 girls who'd gone missing and been found quickly, shaken but unharmed. All 6 towns had a black SUV spotted on gas station cameras. Dan pinned the photo to the center. Echo lay beneath the board, watching, waiting. This wasn't over. Echo stood at the edge of the map in Dan's living room, staring up at the pins like he understood. 6 pushpins marked 6 towns, 6 girls, 6 near misses, and 1 black SUV. Dan hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. Coffee only made his hands shake faster. He had a folder stuffed with grainy security cam screenshots, timestamps, police notes, and unofficial tips scribbled in blue pen. No name, no face, no suspect. Yet, he glanced at Echo, whose tail twitched like a clock hand waiting to strike. You ready to find him? Echo stood. Answer received. The SUV was last seen in Silverside, 2 hours east. A quiet stretch of rural highway, orchards, and truck stops. Local cops called a random vehicle passing through. Dan didn't believe in random anymore. He packed Echo into his unmarked Explorer and headed east before sunrise. No sirens, no backup, just a man and a dog chasing what the system refused to see. They arrived in Silverside by 8:15 a.m. Dan skipped the police station, heading straight to the last confirmed sighting, a convenience store parking lot near Route 39. The clerk remembered the SUV. Slick, black, tinted windows. Guy didn't come in. Just sat in the lot for a while. Did you get a plate? Dan asked. The man scratched his chin. Nope, no front plate. Kinda shady, to be honest. Dan showed him a blurry cam still. That's it. That's the one. Dan and Echo canvassed the area for an hour. Echo sniffed a lot, then circled to a drainage ditch separating the pavement from dense trees. He stopped, ears forward, body stiff, tail low but alert. Got something. Echo moved forward, slow and focused. The trail led into brush, over a bent wire fence, through woods, and into a clearing. In the center stood an old barn, half collapsed, rusted tools hanging from its walls. Echo paused near the door and barked once. Dan drew his sidearm. The barn smelled of mold and gasoline. Tarps covered something in the corner. Echo growled and moved toward them. Dan pulled one back. Plastic bins. One held fast food wrappers. Another, zip ties and duct tape. The third, children's clothes. Dan froze. A pink shoe. A red backpack with faded stickers. He took photos, careful not to touch. Echo barked again, sharper, at the back of the barn. Behind a sagging hay bale, a trapdoor. Dan opened it. A tunnel, maybe 15 feet, dug into the dirt, reinforced with plywood. Echo wouldn't go in. He sat at the entrance and whimpered. That was enough. Dan backed out, heart racing. He called Mia. You're not going to believe what we found. He texted her the location and photos. This guy's not just moving around, Mia replied. He's planning, creating safe spots. Dan nodded, though she couldn't see. Yeah, it is. He wanted to stake it out, wait for the guy to return, but protocol and gut told him to lock it down and walk away. They needed a net, not a shootout. He flagged the location anonymously through a task force contact, hoping to keep it quiet. Then he and Echo drove back to the main road. At a gas station, while Dan filled the tank, Echo growled low. Dan looked up. Across the street, parked by mailboxes, was a black SUV. Windows dark, engine running, no plate. Dan's heart slammed into his ribs. He reached for his radio, then stopped. No jurisdiction, no warrant, no probable cause. But he had Echo, and Echo wasn't. Echo barked sharply the next morning while Dan reviewed files. It wasn't just a bark, it was a summons. Dan followed him to the hallway. Echo stood frozen, nose pointed at a floor vent. He whined softly, then tapped the vent cover with his paw. Dan crouched. The metal was cold. Something below. He pried it loose with a screwdriver. What he saw made his stomach lurch. A small, fabric-covered book stuffed into the duct, like someone never wanted it found. Dan pulled it out, wiped away dust. A child's diary. The name on the first page, Samantha D. The date, October 12th, 2016. Older than Lily. Dan brought it to Mia. She read it slowly, flipping pages like she was unwrapping a bomb. This girl talks about being locked in a place, she whispered. Hearing footsteps, voices. Someone left food, but never let her out. Dan's hands curled into fists. Was she ever reported missing? Mia ran the name. No matches. But the handwriting was real. The emotions raw. Too many details for fiction. In the back, a drawing. A dog with the words, I heard him, but he didn't find me. Dan's chest went cold. This wasn't Lily. No, Mia said softly. This was someone before her. Dan returned to the Silverside barn, now locked with federal tape. He used a contact to get inside quietly. Echo sniffed the room's edges again, then went to the back wall, sat, whimpered, and pawed gently at the floorboards. Dan pried one up. Another crawled tunnel. Inside, a blanket, empty juice boxes, and small ballet slippers covered in dust. Dan's breath caught. They'd missed her. Ground penetrating, radar was called in. Cadaver dogs. They found 3 more dugouts. Empty but lived in. The case was reclassified. Serial abduction. Dan stood at the edge of one hole and whispered, How many did we save? Echo whimpered, then barked at nothing, or something only he could feel. That night, Dan sat with Echo and reread the diary, circling names, landmarks, times. One phrase stood out, the house with yellow stairs. He ran it by Mia. There's no address. Just that, over and over. That's not much to go on. Echo doesn't need much. They spent days driving rural backroads. Echo rode in front, more alert than ever. They passed farms, sheds, motels, nothing. Then, Thursday morning, Dan stopped at a gas station for coffee. He came out to find Echo on the truck's hood, ears forward, body tense. What is it? Echo leapt off and ran toward property, an old ranch house, fenced in, overgrown. At the front porch, yellow-painted stairs. Dan's stomach dropped. He called it in as a welfare check. A young deputy responded, unsure. Dan waved his badge. I'll take the lead. They knocked 3 times. No answer. The windows were dark, not broken. Dan circled the house, found a shed in the back. Echo growled the moment the door opened. Inside, a cot, a bucket, a lock on the outside. Dan stepped back. This isn't a shed. It's a cage. A warrant was issued within the hour. Inside the house, files. Hundreds of photos, names, handwritten notes. Only one room was used. The rest was storage. Boxes of clothes, old shoes, school IDs. Echo sat in the center, still, but watching. 3 more victims were identified, all rescued, all relocated. Each told a different story, but now it was one story. One man, one network, one dog that never gave up. Dan met Lily at a school presentation. They'd asked him to bring Echo. She stood in the front row, taller now, hair neatly braided. When she saw Echo, she ran forward. He wagged his tail and let her hug him. I told my class you saved me, she said. But I know you don't like being the center of attention. Dan smiled. He likes people like you more than cameras. Later, Dan sat on his porch, Echo beside him. The wind was soft. No sirens. No urgency. You tired? Dan asked. Echo blinked slowly. Dan leaned back. We might not get every one of them, but you gave us a start. Echo laid his head on Dan's boot. The mission wasn't over, but for the first time, they were ahead. Dan wasn't a rule breaker by nature. But chasing ghosts, ones that breathe, walk, and vanish just before you reach them, makes rules feel like blinders. When the FBI sealed the case, Dan didn't argue. He quietly made copies of everything. 2 weeks after the Yellow Stairs house, 3 girls were reunited with families. 2 suspects were arrested in other counties, linked through the files. But the man in the SUV, still silent, still nameless. Some agents thought he was a pawn. Others, something worse. Dan believed both. Echo wouldn't rest. He paced at night, scratched at doors, stared at shadows too long. Dan knew that behavior. Something was unfinished. He met me at a diner off I-84. Booth by the window, coffee waiting. I'm tired, she said before he sat down. They exchanged a look, the kind forged in darkness. Any updates? Dan asked. Feds are bottling it. They think the media store will die if they go silent. They're wrong. She leaned in. Dan, I got a call from a foster home in Sheridan. Girl said she saw a man watching her school. Described the SUV. Even said he had a limp. Dan's eyebrows lifted. A limp? Yeah. There was a Ford dugout, Dan said slowly. Back near the barn. Smaller, barely used. You think it was his? Dan didn't answer. Echoes shifted under the table, ears twitching. He's not done, Dan said. No, he's not. By morning, Dan decided. No waiting for permission. He and Echo headed to Sheridan in civilian clothes. No badge, no announcement, just observation. The school was surrounded by farmland, a church across the road. Perfect for someone to watch unnoticed. Dan parked 2 blocks away, walked Echo around the perimeter. Nothing. On the second pass, Echo stopped near trash bins, sniffed once, then growled. Dan knelt. Beneath the bins, under wet cardboard, a white baseball cap. Plain, but inside the brim, smudged a single letter, S. Dan bagged it, no questions. They stayed in town, slept in the truck behind an abandoned gas station. Echo curled in the passenger seat, eyes open even at rest. At 2 a.m., Echo sat up sharply. Dan blinked awake. What is it? Echo whined, staring out the windshield. A black SUV rolled past the intersection. No lights, no music, just motion. Dan's heart pounded. He waited until it turned, then followed. No headlights, just dashboard glow. The SUV pulled into lot 27 of a trailer park outside city limits. Parked. No one got out. Dan watched for 20 minutes. Stillness. Then Echo growled deep and low. That was enough. Dan didn't call local PD. No time to be told no. He slipped from the truck, flashlight and sidearm in hand. Echo followed without command. The trailer was rusted, porch sagging, no lights. Dan crept up the steps, Echo behind. He knocked once. Nothing. Again. A shuffle inside, then silence. Sheriff's department. Dan called. Opened the door. Silence. Then a crash. Back window. Running feet. Dan and Echo bolted around the trailer. Saw a figure running through a field, limping slightly. Echo, take. The dog launched, connected mid-sprint. They went down hard. Dan cuffed him seconds later. The man shook but said nothing. Dan pulled his wallet. No ID, but folded in the cash, a photo, a young girl, not Lily, not any rescued girls. Someone knew. Dan handed him to the feds the next morning. They processed him quietly, like another day at the office. Dan stayed behind. The photo led to a town 3 hours east, population 900. The girl's name was Emily, missing 2 months. Locals thought she'd run away. Dan knocked on her mother's door, placed the photo in her hands. She collapsed. Echo stood behind, tail down, head lowered. Emily was found a week later, in a locked basement 3 counties over. Alive, barely. Dan returned to the station to find a letter. You're suspended pending review of unauthorized field action. He folded it, trashed it, and walked out to his truck. Echo was waiting. They drove home in silence. No music, no radio, just wind and Echo's tail tapping the back seat. Dan didn't need the badge. He had Echo. They were still chasing what others gave up on. Without the badge, Dan felt naked after 15 years. Authority, protection, rules. They'd become too small for what he and Echo had seen. Sometimes, doing right meant